Today's Imprint Weekly podcast is brought to you by Accenture. Change is afoot in child welfare. Change that means agencies focus on results for children and keep far more of them safe at home with their own families. Accenture's child welfare team is leading the way in the effort to ensure technology does its part in that success story. Accenture offers cutting-edge case management tools that ensure agencies can see insights that drive decision-making and caseworkers have information they need at their fingertips. Together, these tools help agencies stay laser-focused, reinventing child welfare into a source of strength for families when they need it. For more information, visit www.accenture.com/childwelfare.
Hello and welcome to the Imprint Weekly Podcast. I'm John Kelly, Senior Editor of the Imprint, a daily news site covering child welfare and youth justice around the country. You can read all of our coverage at imprintnews.org or check us out on Facebook or Twitter at the Imprint News. You can sign up on our homepage for our free weekly and monthly newsletters. And for professionals in child welfare and youth justice, subscribe to our Youth Services Insider section for a closer look at news on business policy and practice. The Imprint Weekly Podcast is also a member of the SafeCamp Audio Network. Check out our show page and all of SafeCamp's other great podcasts at safecampaudio.org, on the web, or at SafeCamp Audio on all social media. On this week's episode, we begin our summer of SafeCamp Spotlights, where we will be talking to the hosts of each of the shows featured on our great new podcast network, SafeCamp Audio, which I just mentioned. I just finished these interviews up. They're really great. These guys are all great podcast hosts with very cool backstories on how it all started for them. Some of them are brand new to the podcast game, like Ivory Bennett, who just released episode 1 of her show this summer. Today, we're going to talk to really one of the first people in the child welfare space to launch a podcast, and that is April Dinwoodie, the host of Born in June, Raised in April. The name is a nod to the fact that her biological mom named her June, her adoptive mother named her April, and the show features guests, but also really focuses on some pretty deeply personal reflections by April about her experience with transracial adoption, reconnecting with her biological family, and much more. Before we get to that conversation, let's hit a few headlines for the week, a mix of some state legislation as legislators wrap up for the year in many states, court decisions, and some federal stuff. We'll start with this. As we've discussed recently on the podcast, one of the most consistent legislative themes this season in red states has been laws that either ban or extremely limit access to some forms of gender-affirming care for transgender youth, particularly medications to block the progression of puberty and any surgeries or medical procedures. So far, 20 states have taken action on such legislation, and at least 5 have made it a felony crime. You might ask, what does this have to do with child welfare? Well, obviously, if, these surgeries are considered a felony or a crime in different ways in these states, parents who would consent to doing them or doctors who would consent to doing them would be abusing children, right? That's sort of implicit in violating the criminal code to provide medication or procedures to kids. And actually, back about a year or so, when Texas failed to pass legislation back in, I think, 2022, or could have been 2021, I'm not remembering right now, when they failed to get a bill passed that would have banned gender-affirming care for minors, it was then that Governor Greg Abbott of Texas created quite a controversy down there by instructing his child welfare agency to start to consider the provision of such services to be child abuse. So it was an end around because the law hadn't passed. Now, I was a little surprised how many states, including Texas, by the way, who has since passed legislation banning gender-affirming care, how many of these states moved forward with these bills during this legislative session, because basically all of the early actors on these bans were taken right to court by the Department of Justice or by others, and the status of these bills was in limbo. And in the past few weeks, courts have come down against these laws, at least in part. So just a little recap. On June 20th of this year, a federal judge struck down Arkansas's ban on gender-affirming care for transgender minors. This was the first ban passed in the nation. The second state to pass a ban was Alabama, and a judge blocked part of that ban a year ago. He actually blocked the part that banned puberty blockers, leaving just a ban on surgeries, and that law is currently active in Alabama. So last year, Alabama judge blocked part of the ban. That's all in limbo. A federal judge struck down Arkansas's ban on June 20th. Now, just a week after the judge squashed the Arkansas ban, different federal judges in Kentucky and Tennessee acted in a manner similar to their Alabama colleagues. So the puberty blockers ban was halted. In Tennessee, a ban on surgeries was left untouched, and the case in Kentucky actually did not cover surgery. That was not part of the lawsuit, so that was kind of not ruled on. So basically in those three states, Alabama, Kentucky, and Tennessee, the ban on puberty blockers was essentially stopped, and all three of those states currently still have a ban on surgery. So all in all, pretty bad outings in federal court for the gender-affirming care bans, which surely are all going to be appealed. I am not smart enough to know if this is on the fast track to the Supreme Court at this point, but I do know that disparate rulings in the lower courts tend to spark some interest among the Supreme Court justices historically. That is fertile ground if you've got, different districts and different circuits ruling in different directions. That's obviously a situation where it's right for the Supreme Court to come in and just settle the score or settle the debate, if you will. So if all these state laws, right, like I said, there's 20 of them now, are going to be challenged in federal courts, pretty good chance, we've seen these states have federal judges block at least a part of it and let some of it go. There's a pretty good chance some judges are going to uphold them entirely or strike them down entirely, like in Arkansas. We might need a national call on the constitutionality of these laws. And again, far from a constitutional scholar here, but it seems like perhaps the fault line will be between this issue of puberty blockers and of surgeries. And why that's important is the latter of those two, actual surgeries performed on minors, is very, very rare. The former, puberty blockers, that is a much more frequent part of treatment for gender dysphoria in minors. So we'll continue to kind of keep tabs on this on the podcast. I know there's a lot of interest in this issue, but yeah, in the last month, there's been 3 federal judges in 3 different states basically saying, as far as the puberty blockers go, those laws are put on hold at best or struck down, as in the case of Arkansas. In 2022, Arizona seized a total of $6.25 million from Social Security benefits from about 700 foster youth. They used that money to help pay for the cost of those youth's stay in the system. This year, according to reporting by the Arizona Capital Times, which I will drop a link to, Arizona is going to be the first state through legislation to put a full-on ban in place to keep these Social Security benefits from being touched by the system and be preserved for the youth in foster care to manage themselves or through their parents or family members. Arizona joins several cities that have already taken action on this. That includes Los Angeles, Philadelphia, and New York City. And if this sounds like Greek to you, this is something we have discussed a while back ago on the podcast, but essentially some really great reporting by, I think, ProPublica and the Marshall Project at the time. The imprint has certainly stayed on and kind of scrutinized state laws since that reporting. But basically what kind of has been lifted up is a not well-kept secret in the child welfare system that states have made themselves the payee on Social Security benefits that are owed to youth in foster care, and then have used that money. Now, it's legal to do this as long as a state is making itself the payee to use that money to spend on things that would not be normally kind of part of the regular old cost of foster care. It kind of has to be above and beyond. And these Social Security benefits, if you're sitting here thinking, like, why would a teenager or why would a youth in foster care get benefits? If a parent dies as a survivor benefit or disabilities, supplemental Social Security pays out for that stuff. So basically, it was a situation where many, many states were tapping into the Social Security benefits that were going to youth in foster care to sort of supplement or pay for, offset the cost of foster care, and that was a no-no. But really also what there's a lot of pressure on now is this idea that they could simply kind of quietly come in and become the payee without going through a notification process that would involve telling the child, for starters, or family members that they could become a payee and a receiver of those benefits to, hopefully in some cases or many cases save them for the children for when they turned 18 and became adults. So I would not be surprised to see some more states follow suit on this, because I think, and Darcy Olson, who's a prominent child advocate in Arizona, kind of described this in the Arizona Capital Times reporting here, that the consensus around this issue of using Social Security benefits of youth in any way within the child welfare context is one of those things that's technically legal on some level, poorly monitored, and possibly just immoral across the board. Also, on the financial protection front for foster youth, there were two pretty rough headlines recently around data breaches that figure to dramatically impact people who experience a foster care system in Minnesota and Illinois. And we're not talking just about the ones who are in those systems now. I'll link to the coverage in our notes, but in Minnesota, a data breach at the Minnesota Department of Education caused a cyber attack that led to the information of about 95,000 students who had been placed in foster care getting accessed. And that really ticked off leaders at Foster Advocates. It's a statewide organization that advocates on behalf of current and former foster youth, who they had actually warned the Department of Education about this after a hack of the Minneapolis public schools back in February. So Hong Murphy, who is the organization's former executive director, he actually just left that title, told the local ABC affiliate in Minneapolis that, quote, "We met with the department and said, you're probably next, and there are huge files and vulnerabilities that you are needing to protect with fosters." And he followed that by saying that this issue has impacted him professionally for sure, but it's also deeply personal. "I was in Minnesota's foster care system. My data is likely in this data set." In terms of communicating with youth and young adults connected with his organization, he said he's been advising everyone to assume they've been compromised, freeze their credit, get with their banks on security, etc., which is very good advice. The data breach reported in June by Lutheran Social Services of Illinois is bigger. It's an estimated 150,000 people's information, but since the organization does a ton of social services work, not just in the child welfare arena, foster youth and former foster youth are likely only a fraction of the identity information that was compromised at Lutheran Social Services. But both of these are really scary reminders of just how vulnerable youth in the system are to having their information snatched. Their information is just in different files in a lot of different places, even as they are among the people who can often least afford to weather the kinds of financial calamity and theft that comes with identity theft, early in adulthood. On June 30th, when the doors clanked shut at California's 3 remaining state-run juvenile facilities, it was done for the last time, at least in their run of housing incarcerated youth. So in a process that began a few years ago, but really truly started decades ago, the state has officially left the business of juvenile incarceration, and that leaves basically all of juvenile justice operations in the hands of the 58 California counties. I'm going to link in the show notes to some truly terrific reporting that Nell Bernstein did for us here at the Imprint in the lead up to the closure for a series that we called The Darkest Part of the Tunnel. That is a reference to the headline of one of the stories. I really recommend reading it if you're interested in juvenile justice at all, particularly in California. If you want to learn about the parent activism and legal advocacy that led to California's youth prisons first shrinking and then going away entirely, you're going to want to check this out. In addition, Nell reports on the fears now among some in the state that counties are just simply not ready to do a better job with incarceration than the state, nor are they geared enough towards, providing alternatives to incarceration. And she closed out the series by kind of connecting up what's going on in California to the broader trends in the United States when it comes to locking children up. I'm also going to link to some reporting from the Imprint's Jeremy Loudenbeck and Sarah Tiano about some new funding for education that's aimed at supporting better academic achievement for California youth who are incarcerated or who are returning home to what's generally known as alternative schools within county systems. In addition to a lot of new money for those two things, $80 million for alternative schools, a continuation of $15 million going to higher education programs inside of juvenile facilities. The California budget also is going to require the state to produce an independent audit of outcomes for youth in juvenile court and alternative schools by November of 2025, and that should produce some very interesting findings. Next week, I'm going to talk about some other stuff in the California budget and legislative pipeline. There's a lot going on in terms of housing supports for youth in foster care, but we're going to save that for another day. Let's finish this week with some news from Capitol Hill. January Contreras was confirmed to lead the Biden administration's Administration for Children and Families in April of 2022. That is the agency within the Department of Health and Human Services that oversees much of the federal spending on things like child welfare, family support, child care, Head Start, all those things. Now, just a little over a year into her tenure, Contreras has announced that she is going to leave the administration in August to return to Arizona. Jeff Hild, who is the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary at ACF now, is going to become the Acting Assistant Secretary upon Contreras' departure. Jeff Hild was Legislative Director on Capitol Hill for 7 years before he became actually Chief of Staff at ACF during the Obama administration. And the guess here is that Mr. Hild will serve as the Acting Assistant Secretary for ACF at a minimum through the entirety of the first term of the Biden administration. I don't see them nominating another person to lead this agency and working confirmation through during what is essentially going to start being a re-election campaign pretty soon here. We'll see if they come back and put somebody prominent in there, not to take away from Jeff Hild in his career, but January Contreras was a prominent official within the Obama administration at the Department of Homeland Security. She went back to Arizona and started a really great legal clinic that supports, among other things, attorneys and counsel for youth in foster care and youth who arrive unaccompanied at the border from Central America. The last thing for this week, I wanted to mention that a bill has been reintroduced that aims to protect disabled parents from overreach by child welfare systems. The Equality for Families with Disabilities Act would require state agencies to include in their federally reviewed child welfare plans an explanation of the, quote, procedural safeguards and supportive parenting services, end quote, that it offers to disabled people who are either parents or relatives, foster or adoptive parents. The explanation has to be fact-specific according to the bill and lay out a parenting assessment process that focuses on the strengths and needs of a person with a disability. So in other words, you have to show on paper that you have a process at the state level for engaging with parents who experience a disability or relatives who do, a process that really focuses on strengths and is not geared towards any sort of decision making, whereas, a person's disability might be a driving force or, a compelling factor in particular, the removal of a child from a parent. One significant thing here, this bill picked up a new lead sponsor in Representative Sheila Sherfulis McCormick, who is a Democrat that represents Florida's 20th district, who has emerged as a legislator very interested in child welfare as an issue, and that is noteworthy in and of itself in a year where the House lost who many viewed as the leader on the subject of child welfare for years, now Mayor of Los Angeles, Karen Bass. So the bill has a new champion after the retirement of its old author, Representative Jim Langevin of Rhode Island, who himself was a very staunch advocate for both the disabled and for youth in foster care. So he was another loss as far as legislators who are knowledgeable in the House on child welfare issues. Downside for this bill right now, it does not appear to have a Republican co-sponsor, which is kind of the ticket to get in if you're a piece of legislation that could get slapped into things like spending bills and things like that. It's a much higher chance if you've got that bipartisan tag on you, where this bill had that in previous years. So we'll see if any Republicans sign on for the Equality for Families with Disabilities Act. All right, when we come back, our SafeCamp Spotlight interview with April Dinwoodie, host of Born in June, Raised in April.
The National Association of Counsel for Children advances children's and parents' rights by supporting a diverse, inclusive community of child welfare lawyers to provide zealous legal representation, and by advocating for equitable anti-racist solutions co-designed by people with lived experience. Learn more at naccchildlaw.org, counselforkids.org, and at our 46th National Child Welfare Law Conference this August.
Okay, time for another SafeCamp Spotlight interview. All summer, we are bringing in hosts from SafeCamp's inaugural group of member podcasts. You can check out all of these podcasts at safecampaudio.org, and we are regularly promoting and featuring their work on social media. You can follow us on any of the big ones at SafeCamp Audio. Today, we have April Dinwoodie, the host of Born in June, Raised in April, where she examines her efforts to find love, identity, family, and connection, most often with a great guest on hand for it. So, April, welcome back to the Imprint Weekly podcast.
Hello. Thanks for having me, John. Great to be here.
All right. Rules are, as always on the Imprint Weekly podcast, got to get them to know you a little bit before we talk about your podcast. So you got to give me a favorite. The categories are TV or movie, sports team, musical group, or book. You don't have to give me one in each. You just have to give me one or more. What do you got, April?
Oof, that's always so hard. Well, Stevie Wonder just comes in just as a universal talent gift to the
Totally.
To the world. So any and all Stevie, I'm here for.
I'm with you on that one. Okay, so describe Born in June, Raised in April in 3 sentences or less for people.
Named June at birth and then April through adoption. This podcast helps unpack the complexities of family separation, differences of race, class, and culture with the calendar as a universal guide.
I love that. So when did you start the podcast and how did this come about? I mean, take us back to the early days when you decided to do this. You're probably one of the longest running podcasts of child welfare. Might be one of the first
adoption.
5. Yeah.
I'm
certainly
here for
adoption.
It.
Yeah.
I'm here for that. So it began in essence when I did a 6-word adoption memoir workshop at Joyce McGuire Pavo's summer intensive conference in P-Town a long time ago. A woman named Penny, I'm not going to get her last name right. Her name is Penny. I can see her in my brain, but she does a lot of writing work with adopted persons and members of the community and really is super creative. She's a poet and did this workshop. And first I was like, no, this is sort of weird. Like, what was 6-word memoir? I don't know. And then by the time I was done, I was like, wow, this is pretty amazing. And my 6 words came to me pretty easily: born in June, raised in April, 6 words. So that in essence became a container for me that became the podcast when I was sitting on the beach down the Jersey Shore with my biological first cousin, Madeline, who has been on the podcast. She and I were talking, and she's a new family member because I reunited several years before that. And she was like, you know what, April, you got a lot of context. You got a lot of content. Your storytelling is really spot on. You're so open and vulnerable. You should have a podcast. I thought, Her son, my nephew, or my cousin, my cousin, her son, the family matrix, was in school for production on a lot of levels, audio being one of them. So in one sort of moment, I had the idea for the construct of the podcast, monthly podcast, identity, relationships, facing and embracing differences. The construct was there. The inspiration for someone I highly respected, Madeline, is the CEO of CHOP, Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. She's amazing. For someone like her to think that I had something to say and people would listen, that gave me inspiration. And then I had the audio engineer. I was like, I got this. And then a dear friend of mine is a producer of music and content, and he jumped in as my executive producer. And before I knew it, I literally had a podcast. Like it actually wasn't really that hard in the beginning to make it happen.
Wow, that's some real stars aligned stuff right there. At the time when this is all coming together, were you even a consumer of podcasts? I was going to ask about your influences in this world. What are your favorite ones to listen to, either in this kind of lane of child welfare stuff or just general pop culture?
I started to listen to Serial right out the gate, early days. I was like a number of folks that I know, and certainly by what you see in terms of the folks behind that podcast and their rise in the podcasting world and content world, was inspired by that, just the narrative storytelling of it and just the intrigue. So early on, I was listening to that series. And then I'm a really interesting podcast listener in a way. I have this little bit of a hodgepodge. I love Life Kit, a lot of NPR stuff. Just they're easy to listen to. They're usually pretty tight. A few diversity and inclusion podcasts that I like. I do sort of stay in I guess you would call it like spirituality, self-help. I listen to a few podcasts in that realm. And I tend to stay away from other child welfare podcasts because it's like a little bit of a rabbit hole. And I worry that I'm gonna just get sucked way too in. So I kind of stay in things that aren't child welfare because I'm in child welfare so much that I sort of need things to be not that in my podcast world.
Yeah, makes sense. So I won't make you alienate any particular guest you had by forcing you to pick from the construct of your favorite episode. Let me ask it this way. This is what I've been asking all your colleagues. Which episode of Born in June, Raised in April stands out to you as the particular embodiment of what you're trying to do? You know what I mean? Which one do you go back and say, man, this is the one I'd offer up as an example? Somebody was like, what is this about?
Well, one that stands out the most, and for me, just personally, because it was a real joy, was the one I did with DMC, Darryl McDaniels run DMC. I mean, my childhood hero, someone who was a real entry point for me for music and identity and all the things, to be sitting next to him. And then in another episode, his wife and him talking about our shared experiences of adoption and family separation blew my mind. I mean, it just blew my mind. So it's one that's a favorite for me. And it's also one that I do think exemplifies the podcast, being that it's these conversations about shared experiences, identity development, family connections, disconnections, and the impact that it has on us and what we do with that. He really has a lot to say, and just was a joy. On a whole nother level, the parent podcasts that I do, the ones I've done with my parents, have been the ones I'm most proud of, and really do, I think, shine a light on this real-time listening experience, which is I can love my parents that raised me, my parents of experience, as I refer to them, and I could still have difficult conversations with them about some of the things that I think should have been better, and things they should have been kind of tuned into. That said, the hardest part of this podcast endeavor is what will the people that are closest to me feel and think about this content. How will my family that I love so dearly, that I was closest to and remain closest to now, my adoptive family, how will they intake this content? And now I also think about my family of origin, who now listens to the podcast as well. So I'm really always negotiating what someone will think or feel about it. And as an extension, I think about the listeners, and I don't take responsibility for how they listen and what they feel, but I certainly am thinking about that as I think about the people that are close into me.
All right, stepping out of the podcast realm, just curious what you're contemplating and thinking about these days. So what are you most optimistic about, and what concerns you the most about child welfare at the moment?
I think what concerns me the most about child welfare is what concerns me the most about life in modern times, which is a lack of practice, skill, interest in equity, inclusion, how systems have impacted disproportionately persons of color, And the fact that we have so much catching up to do with that, just in general, but closer into child welfare feels just a whole different level of urgent, because there's a certain point in time where people age out of being able to shift perspective and operating principles as humans. We have such an opportunity with younger people and families today that we can keep together, keep whole, keep supporting, and when necessary, support those children that are separated from those families for their best interest. But it's the hardest thing I think I see is that we're not moving quickly enough in the direction of better policy practice and general care and concern for any level of diversity, not just racial diversity. And what makes me hopeful is the engagement of younger persons that with lived expertise. One of the projects I'm working on that I've been working on for a while now is the Quality Improvement Center on engaging youth, children and youth in finding permanency. And the biggest joy and the most hope I have is in a room with the council members who all are lived experts. And what I love about being in those rooms, in that space, is I'm sort of like a connecting point to the senior leaders. They have connecting points to the senior leaders for sure, but I often find myself kind of helping to navigate that space in between, where you've got senior leaders on projects who don't have lived expertise, are not of the same generation as the generation that we're talking to and listening to. And it is challenging work. So I often find myself in that space of kind of bringing the two groups a little bit more together with a lot of amazing leaders. It's almost like it's not my job in written form, but it's what I do as a support to everybody. And that feels very hopeful, not just my ability to do that, which I think I've honed over years, but really being part of that, it is just really, really hopeful to me.
Very cool. All right, the show is born in June, raised in April. She is April Dinwoodie. April, thanks for jumping on with us on the Imprint Weekly podcast.
Thank you, John. It's a joy. Thanks for all you do to keep this content going and making our voices heard.
Thanks to April Dinwoodie, host of Born in June, Raised in April, for joining us today. The Imprint Weekly podcast is a production of the SafeCamp Audio Network, which is the division of Fostering Media Connections. Please visit safecampaudio.org on the web or at SafeCamp Audio on all major social media. This podcast is produced and mixed by Christine Anjoko with music by Luke Giroux and Cyrus Elia. If you enjoyed this episode, we'd love it if you consider subscribing or giving us a 5-star rating on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you download your podcasts. And we'd greatly appreciate if you consider supporting our work here on the podcast and in print. Small donations from our listeners and readers go a long way towards helping us grow and cover more great stories in child welfare and youth justice. To support us is very easy. Just visit imprintnews.org/donate. You can follow The Imprint on Twitter and Facebook by searching the handle at The Imprint News and visit us on the web at imprintnews.org. You can always email us at tips@imprintnews.org. I'm John Kelly, and we'll see you next week.